Hi, this is Simon from Tokyo Productions and welcome to another tutorial for Motion 5. And today we're going to be looking at this cool looking motion graphics project. Now, I can't take any of the credit for the design of this, which is down to Andrew Kramer and another great After Effects tutorial on videocopilot.net. But the reason for this tutorial is that the techniques required to create this project are completely different in Motion as against After Effects. So anyway, let's dive in and see how it all works. I've got a new project here that's 1920 1080, 24 frames a second, and I'm going to make it 4 seconds long. And my first step is going to be to come over to the library, and I'm going to look for the Shapes category, and I'm going to look for Hexagon, and I'm going to apply that. Then I'm going to come over to the inspector, I'm going to turn off fill, and I'm going to turn on outline. And I'm going to set the outline width to 25. Let me just zoom in on this a little bit so we can see exactly what's happening here. First of all, I want to create an animation for this outline. So I'm going to come to the 1 second mark on the timeline, and I'm going to keyframe the first point offset and the last point offset. I'm going to come back to the first frame. I'm going to set the first point offset to 100%. Then I'm going to come to 2 seconds on the timeline, and I'm going to keyframe the last point offset down to 0. And if we play that, you'll see we get it writing on and writing off in one continuous movement. Okay, let's just have a quick look at this shape before we move on. You'll notice that we've got rounded corners to the hexagon, and I don't want that. So I'm going to come over to the outline here, and where it says joint, I'm going to select square, and you can see that creates nice sharp corners. I also don't like these rounded leading edges. So I'm going to change the start and end cap to bevel, and you'll see we get this much nicer, sharp beveled edge. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a replicator. So I'm going to hit L, or I could come to Object, Replicate. Let's zoom out, and let's just set the replicator shape to line. And what we need to do is we need to zero out these two X values. So X start 0, X end is also 0, and we'll leave the number of points at 5. And then we'll come down here to the scale, and I want to set that to 150. And I'll set the scale end to 20% and the scale randomness also to 20%. And then I'll come to the angle end here, and I'll set that to 240 degrees. And now if we play that, you'll see we've already got a pretty interesting looking animation. Now, because this has got a random element in the scale randomness here, if we don't like the look of that, we can click on the random seed button and get a different result. I'm going to probably go for something like that. It doesn't really matter. The key to this project is really to do your own thing and not get too hung up on specific numbers. Okay, so what about some colour? I don't like the fact that it's all white, so I'm going to come down to the colour mode here, and I'm going to select over pattern. And what that does is it automatically creates a colour gradient. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a built-in gradient. Come over here, and I'm going to select beachfront. And you'll see how that disperses those colours from that gradient across the pattern. Don't worry, we're going to do a bit of colour correction later on. All I wanted at this point was to have a bit of colour variation in the replicator. Okay, so the next thing to do is to take that hexagon and drag it out into a new group just to keep things tidy. And this group I'm going to call Geometry. And then I'm going to take that hexagon, right click, duplicate, and I'm going to call it hexagon thin just so we know what's going on here. come over to the outline width and set a value of 10. Then I'm going to come to the replicator, right click, duplicate, call this replicator thin again so we know what we're talking about. Drag the hexagon thin into the source well for replicator thin. And then I'm going to come over to its properties, transform, twirl open rotation, and set a Y rotation of 180. And I'll come back to the replicator gradient here, and let's select Atlantic blue in this case. And we can just make a little bit of an adjustment to the scale, just so we've got something a little bit different. I'm going to increase that scale to 170, and let's have a look at how that plays. Pretty nice. Okay, so let's do something else now. Let's come back to geometry, and let's select C for the circle tool, and we'll come to Window, Show HUD, or F7 if you prefer. I will select an outline color of white, and we'll have a width of 7. And then I'm going to click in the center, holding down the Shift and Alt key, and drag out a circle. I'll come over to the properties, transform, and I will reset the X and Y values so my circle is in the center. Let me just turn off the group with the replicators in it first of all, just so we can see that circle on its own. Then I'm going to come to the Shape tab here, and under Brush Type I'm going to select Airbrush. And I'm just going to twirl open the brush profile, and I'm going to select this left-hand tab, the white one there at the top, and under Location I'm going to type 90%. Then I'm going to set a spacing value down here of 300, and that's going to give me dots instead of a continuous circle, which is what I want. Okay, we just need to do that same trick with the first and last point offset. So if you remember, we came to 1 second, we set a keyframe for first and last point offset, we came to the first frame, we set the first point offset to 100%, we came to 2 seconds, and then we set the last point offset down to 0. And then we get that same effect of the circle writing on. Right then, let's select Replicator Thin and right click Duplicate. Let's call it Replicator Circle. And I'm going to take that circle and I'm going to drag it into the replicator cell for this new replicator. Again, let's just call that circle so we know what's going on here. And we can turn this group back on again and turn off that geometry group. And now we've got these dotted circles as well as our hexagons. Let's come to the circle replicator, and this is all a bit too big. Let's reduce the scale. We just want those to be a little bit larger than the largest hexagon, so that's about 104 there. And then I'm just going to reduce the number of points up here down to 3. Let me just turn off the other 2 just so we can check how that's looking. Yeah, that's not too bad. I'll go with that. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to offset these in time. So how would I do that? Obviously, we could just think about just grabbing one of these and pushing it along, but let me just solo this large layer. Let me call that replicator thick so you understand what I'm saying. Okay, so I've grabbed that, come to the mini timeline, let's move it along. So if we look what happens, the animation of the hexagons writing on is not now timed to the start position of the replicator. So how are we going to fix that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take these 3 replicators and we are going to make clones of them, and that will solve our problem. So I'm going to right click on that replicator and select Make Clone, and I'm going to drag that up into a new group. I'm going to select the replicator thin, again right click, Make Clone Layer, drag it up into the new group, and again the circle layer, right click, Make Clone Layer, drag it up into the new group. And then we can close this original group on down, and we can close that geometry group as well. So now if I solo this bottom layer and we move it along, the timing is now correct because the clone has effectively baked in the timing of the hexagon animation source, if that makes any sense to you. So let's just turn on the other two. And what I want to do is I want to have these circles begin at the beginning. I want to have the thinner one, which is the second one down, start at around 10 frames. So I'm moving that along the mini timeline, so it starts at 10 frames. And the thick one I'm going to move along so it starts at, say, 18 frames, something like that. Not critical. And now let's have a look at it. And that's already looking pretty good, and you can see the advantage of having offset those. It's made the whole animation a lot more interesting. I'm going to do a couple of other things. First of which is that I want to take my dotted circles and I want them to be the last thing we see as well as the first thing we see. So I'm going to take that circles clone layer, which is the top one there, and I'm going to right click, duplicate. And then I'm going to come down to its timing here, twirl that open, and I'm going to click on the reverse button. And let's have a look at where we would like it to end. Let's say we want to end it at about 3 seconds. Let's just drag this back, keep dragging back until we don't see anything. And there we go, now it's the last thing we see as well. So play that. Looking pretty neat. What I might do just to add some variation in this is to cancel out that Y rotation for this, so it goes the opposite way when it finishes. Okay, then I'm going to take the bottom layer there, which is the thick one, and I'm going to duplicate it again. So right click, duplicate. And I'm going to make this a little bit larger, I think. Something like 115, 114, there we go. And I'm going to experiment with its blend mode. So I'm going to have a look at what subtract gives me. And that's kind of already quite interesting. I've added a lot of extra detail using that new blend mode. And I could again flop it on Y by entering a value of 180, so we get even more interest in there. And I think I really quite like that. Another thing I could try is maybe overlay. I don't think that works quite so well with this, although if I came to the library filters color correction and we applied a hue saturation and we reduced the value, that's actually looking quite good. So really play with those blend modes and I think you'll get some interesting results. Okay, now I want to just complicate things a little bit more by adding an image mask, so that's going to break up the uniformity of this. So I'm going to come back to my geometry group. Let's call these clones. Call that group clones. Close that on up and hide that just for 1 second. Turn back on my geometry group, turn off the circle, don't need to see that. And I want to come over to the library, click on the library tab there. I'm going to come to generators. And I'm going to look for 2ColorRay, that's the one right at the bottom there, and I'm going to bring it into the geometry group. So over here in the inspector, let's make a few changes. First of all, I want to twirl open color 1, and I want to set its opacity down to 0. Close that up. Then I want to set the number of divisions to 4. And I want to right click on the rotation, add parameter behavior, oscillate, and I'm going to set an amplitude of 90 and a speed of 20. And you can see that spins the shape. Then I'm going to duplicate this 2ColorRay. So right click, duplicate. And this time I'm going to set the number of divisions to 3. And come to the behaviors. And let's reduce the amplitude down to 60. And maybe the speed down to 15. So if I play that, we've got something that looks a bit like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this composite of these two elements and I'm going to create a mask out of them. So let me select them both and right click, group, and I'll call it Ray Mask. And we can close it, turn it off, turn off geometry. And let's turn back on our clones group and come back to the middle of our animation here, about 1 second and 12 frames. I'm going to select my bottom layer here, the clone layer, and I'm going to right click, add image mask. And then I'm going to take my ray mask and add it to the mask source well. Now if I play that, you can see that's created a much more interesting result. I think what I'm going to do is I'm also going to take this clone layer and duplicate it. So right click, duplicate, and I might just rotate it through 180 on Z, and let's just very slightly increase it like that, I think, and just change its timing. I'm going to drag it forward a few frames till we've got something we like the look of. There you go, quite like that. So that's really not too bad. I think I might take this layer here that we created an overlay with, right click, duplicate. Again, let's undo that Y rotation just so we got a bit of variation, and let's try that subtract trick that we were looking at, and just play with the scale just a little bit. Reduce that down. Really, I want to encourage you to experiment as much as possible and do your own thing rather than worrying about what I've done. Okay, so that's basically it. What I want to do is I want to just color correct this so it's a little bit less vibrant. So I'm going to come over to the library and come over to my filters, color correction, and I'm going to grab a hue saturation filter and add it to that clones group and come to the inspector. And I think I'm just going to enter a saturation value of -0.75. And you see that's just made everything a little bit classier. Okay, so now let's look at creating a background. So I'm going to come over to the library, generators, I'm going to look for color solid, and I'll bring it in to the bottom of the project there, to a new group. Come over to the inspector, click on the color swatch, going to bring the brightness way down, and then I'm going to drag in to reduce the saturation very substantially, something like that. Then I'm going to come back to my library. I'm going to look for the content section here, and then I'm going to click on the search button there, and I'm going to type concrete. And I've got these 3 concrete image maps. I'm going to select concrete 02, and I'm going to bring it into that group just above the color solid. And I'll come over to the inspector, properties, transform, and I'll reset the scale here to 100%. Now I'll come back to the library, filters, clear that search result here, and come to the color correction section. I'm going to select negative, hold down the command key, and I'll also select levels, and I'll apply those to that concrete layer. And I'll come over to the inspector. What I want to do here is grab the black and bring it up just so we start to lose all that black detail and we're just left with those bright spots, something like that. And I'll probably come over to the blend mode, set that to screen, and reduce the opacity probably down to about 50%, maybe even down to 30, just so it's fairly subtle. So the next thing I want to do is to look at the timing of all of this. I want to time it so that the initial assemble takes place quite quickly and we slow down, and then the disassemble happens quickly as well. So in order to do that, I'm going to take that entire clones group there, and I'm going to make a clone of that clones group, and that will allow me to retime all of those layers that are inside that group in one go. So let's right click on that, make clone layer, and that makes a new group with one single layer in it. I'm going to call this group retime. So then I'm going to select that clone layer, and I'm going to come down here to time remap, and I'm going to select variable speed, and I'm going to open up the keyframe editor, and here where it says untitled set, I'm going to select animated. I'm going to come to the first frame, set a keyframe, going to move forward something like 106 in this case, where we've almost got a complete assemble of the graphic, and set a keyframe there, and then come to the last frame that it's visible, set a keyframe there, come back a bit to the point at which it starts to disassemble, and set a keyframe there. And then what I can do is take this second keyframe and move it back in time, holding down the Shift key. So we come to about frame 16 or something like that. So in doing so, I've extended the middle section and I've sped up the start section to be much closer in length to the final disassemble. So I'm going to take the second keyframe, I'm going to right click on it, interpolation, Bezier, and I just want to smooth that off. You can see that Bezier operation has just given me a smooth ramp in and a smooth ramp out. Do the same thing with the third keyframe, right click, interpolation, Bezier. And that's just kept everything smooth. Let's just close up the keyframe editor and have a look at how that plays. And you can see that's much more interesting with that rapid right on and that hold in the middle. You can adjust those to taste, but I think that's working pretty well. So that's a very useful thing to know, that you can do this elaborate retiming using clones. One of the really powerful features of Motion, I think. Okay, so there's one other thing we need to do, and that's create a shadow, or rather a long shadow. So yet again, I'm going to make a clone. So I'm going to take that retime group, right click on it, and make a clone layer. And I'm going to call this group that it's made shadow. And I'm going to come over to the library, look for filters, color correction, and I want to grab hue saturation and add it to that clone layer. And I'll come back to the inspector. Let's just turn off that retime group just so we can see our new group on its own. I'm going to reduce the saturation down to -1, and I'm going to reduce the value almost all the way down, just so we get something that's nearly black but not quite. Then I'm going to select that shadow group. I'm going to come to the library and I'm going to look for filters, distortion, and I'm going to use an unusual filter called scrape, and I'm going to add it to that shadow group. And you can immediately see that's done something quite interesting. If I come over to the inspector and grab the rotation, you can see I can move that around and it's creating a long shadow. Let me enter a value of 150 there, just so it's lining up with those hexagon sides. Now it's not running all the way to the edge of the frame, and to fix that we come to the shadow group, come to the group tab, and we click on fixed resolution, and immediately that fixes it. So now we can turn back on our retime group. We want to move our shadow group down below retime, and that's starting to look quite good. Let me select the shadow group, come to properties, transform. Just want to increase the scale of it a little bit so it's somewhat larger than my main graphic, and set the blend mode to multiply, and let's reduce the opacity down somewhere like 35. Seems to be quite good there. So here's what it's now looking like, and that's really not too bad. There's one thing I want to fix, and that's the order of that circled layer. So I'm going to come back to that clones group, and where are the circles? They're here. Let's grab those and move those down to the bottom of that clones group, just so they're sitting behind rather than in front. I think it looks better. So that's really the basics of how you build this project. You can obviously customize this in an incredible variety of ways. Let's come back to that original group there and take replicator thick, and we could just simply come to our color gradient and select a different option. I'm going to select blue chrome there, for example, and immediately that's a very different look. Or we could try chrome or something, and again that's different. And if you remember, there was also the option of coming in and changing these blend modes here for some different results. Again, you could scale some of these elements and create different things. And because we're using clones throughout the process, everything updates all that timing that we've done, all those elements, they keep following along. So it's a really easy project to customize. So I hope that's been interesting. Thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope you have fun creating your own versions of this. See you again next time.